All close your eyes for a minute and imagine yourself that you are a young, portly, inexperienced book dealer from the great city of Boston in the year 1771 or so. Despite your rebellious leanings, you are trapped in a city that is occupied with no end in sight of the ever-despised British. Now jump forward a few years, and around you crack the flashes and pops of muskets, hundreds of muskets, maybe even thousands of muskets. You are surrounded by the sounds of the cannon, your cannon, as they wash over you, and the other cannon that you command. The uniform of a brigadier general in the Continental Army fits your now much more fit frame than ever before. Your voice echoes through the din as you encourage your men to an even greater effort. And if you can even picture just a little bit of this, then you can begin to get an idea of what one of the unsung heroes of the American Revolution went through. And that man I'm referring to is Major General Henry Knox. Now, you've all heard of Henry Knox. How could you not have heard of him? But when you compare him to many of the other founders, he gets so little respect. And I personally, when I found out about his story from this overweight Boston bookseller to Secretary of War in such a short span of time, I was fascinated by this story. So I chose this opportunity to really dig deeper into his life. And so this afternoon, I'm going to get into some of his story a little bit, some of his youth, through his time in the American Revolution, through his time in the post-war army, and in Washington's initial cabinet. Now, Knox came from a rather modest family, and he kind of got the short end of the stick a little bit because his father was actually very wealthy at one point because he was a shipmaster in the city of Boston. But due to some bad luck and some bad choices, he was forced to sell his house, move to the West Indies to take work, where he died at the ripe old age of 50. Now this left young Henry, who was just the 7th out of 10 children, feeling very responsible for not only his mother, but his siblings as well. So in the 1900 book entitled Henry Knox, Soldier of the Revolution, Noah Brooks stated it best when he said, "Young Henry was a stalwart youngster, fond of manly sports, devoted to his mother, active in affairs that engaged the attention of his neighborhood, and yet at the same time, an unabashed bookworm." So if you ask me, Henry sounded like the perfect youth. A lot like myself when I was a young person. I was into a lot of different things, but I loved to read. And the thing that Knox loved to read the most was anything having to do with military history. He ate it up. And so when he saw the opportunity to become an apprentice at the bookstore of Masters Wharton and Bowes, he snapped at it. And while he was employed here as an apprentice, he was able to indulge his learning, and he read the works of men like Plutarch and all these other ancient historians and warriors, in which he was able to absorb all of their knowledge, their tactics, their strategy, their just general advice. And to tell you a little bit about how serious he was about this, at the time, many of these books had not yet even been made, translated into English. So he had to teach himself how to read French to be able to explore them at all. Now, I think one of the most interesting things that happened to Henry when he was a youngster happened on the night, the very fateful night of March 5th, 1770, which I'm sure many of you recognize that date. He was on his way home from visiting a friend in Charlestown when he came upon a very chaotic scene. And that scene was of a young British officer by the name of Captain Preston, standing between his beleaguered small group of British soldiers, between them and a rowdy, rambunctious, violent crowd of local citizens. Henry knew that nothing good could come of this. So he approached Captain Brooks and he grabbed a hold of his coat and he said, "Please do not fire upon these people. Return your men to their barracks." Now, Preston was not a dummy. He knew that the wisdom coming out of this young man was valid, and he wanted nothing to do with this. Unfortunately, fate, as we all know, had a different plan, and a shot rang out. And the Boston Massacre entered the history books. And this may have been Henry's first experience with violence on a large scale, but he was somewhat familiar with the military because, as was common during this time, he had joined a militia known as the Train when he was 18. And the militia, or the Train, was a little bit different than a lot of the militias at the time because it was full of blue-collar workers, shopkeepers, mechanics, as opposed to a lot of the sons of the wealthy and the rich, as so many other of the militias at the time tended to be. Additionally, the leader of the Train was a very experienced French and Indian War officer who actually trained his men efficiently and effectively, as opposed to being a social club, which so many of the militias at the time tended to be. But this wasn't enough for Knox. So when he was in 1772, he and several of his friends decided to leave and form their own militia, known as the Boston Grenadier Corps. And it was while he was a member, second in command to be precise, of this corps, he began to draw the attention of a lot of high-up people. He drew the eyes of many leaders of the rebellion. He drew the eyes of the British. And most importantly to him, he drew the eyes of a young woman by the name of Miss Lucy Flucker. Now, Lucy came from a Tory family. And when her parents found out that she was being courted by a young man who had very clear ties to the rebellion side of things, they weren't particularly happy, as you can imagine. But Henry was persistent, and so he pushed. And finally the parents relented because they knew that if they didn't relent, they were going to elope. And to them that was worse than marrying a rebel, because that would put a stain on their family's honor. Now this pairing had a pretty unique side effect, and that side effect was that it put Knox into very close contact with the British Army, because Lucy's brother was a member of the Royal Army. And so they began to communicate, and he began to go and observe the British and their exercises. This was stuff that he had just read about before, and now he was getting to see it in person. And he really liked this. I mean, he didn't care for the fact that it was the British, but it gave him contact with real-life military stuff. And on the flip side of that, it made the British aware of him. And he was a very talented young man. He was an excellent leader. He was excellent when it came to strategy and tactics, and the British wanted him. So they offered him several commissions, which luckily for us, he turned down. Because ultimately, like many of his patriotic brethren, he wanted nothing more than to be rid of the British forever. He was just waiting for the right time. And that right time was coming quick. Now, as you can see, his youth was rather unassuming. There wasn't anything particularly special about it. But he rose to great prominence very quickly during the war itself. He volunteered as a private, but he didn't stay a private very long, as his superiors saw his potential, and he rose quickly through the ranks. And as I said, he was waiting for that moment. And that moment happened on the night of April 19th, 1775. And again, that's a date that most of you probably recognize as the date of the battles of Lexington and Concord. And when he heard about these battles, he knew he had to do something. He could no longer sit idly by while his brothers fought and died for the country that he loved so much. So he developed a plan to sneak out of Boston in disguise with his wife, with nothing but his militia sword, which had been sewn into the cloak of his wife's, or sewn into the lining of his wife's cloak. And now, you ask, why did he have to disguise himself? Well, that's because Thomas Gage, the commanding officer of the British forces in Boston, was very angry that he had turned down those commissions. And so he developed a plan to capture Knox, to keep Knox's intelligence, his knowledge, his skill, and his ability out of the hands of those upstart rebels. But he made his way to Cambridge and volunteered, not as an officer, as a private. He turned down commissions. He didn't care. He wanted to be out there planning and implementing the defenses of his beloved city, which he set out to do. And it was while he was doing this work that his superiors became aware of his natural ability as a leader, his drive, his desire, his faith in the American cause, and his ability, his budding ability as an artillerist. And he drew the eyes of men like John Adams and George Washington, who formed a fast friendship that lasted the remainder of their lives. And Washington wrote to the president of the Continental Congress saying Knox should be placed in charge of the entire artillery because the current commander, a man by the name of Colonel Gridley, was old and infirm. And you might be thinking to yourself, especially those of you that have served in the military, that's not how things are done. People of other men in this existing artillery had to be upset about this, right? They had higher rank, they had more experience, they were older. Au contraire, most of these men supported this unanimously because they saw what a special man Henry Knox was. So they had no complaints. So here you have, in a span of just a couple of years, this man going from a Boston bookseller with effectively no military experience to leading what some consider to be the most complicated arm of the army in the artillery in just a couple of years. And many consider this to be Washington's finest appointment in the entire war. Now, Knox did a lot of really important things during the Revolutionary War. One of the most important, at least in my opinion, is what he did, his Herculean efforts to end the occupation of his beloved city of Boston. Now, he knew that if he wanted to get the British out, he had to find heavy cannon, because the existing cannon that they had, it wasn't heavy enough to reach the city, let alone the bay. So they could just escape to the bay. So he developed this brilliant plan to send a small force of men up to Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to get the captured and unused artillery that sat there drawing dust. And he did this all himself. He conceived it, he planned it, he got permission, he got the supplies ready, and on November 15th, he set out. He reached Ticonderoga on the 9th of December, and that's a pretty significant distance, especially when you consider the quality of the roads, the weather, and how far it is. Very difficult terrain. That's through the mountainous areas, that's through the forests. That in itself is pretty amazing. But then after 4 days, that's it, 4 days, it's all it took him to prep and load all of the cannon. And he started back on the 9th of December. Now their first challenge was to move down Lake George, a long skinny lake. So they loaded up the cannon on these flat-bottomed scows and began to set sail, well, to set row south along the lake on a beautiful day. Well, that beautiful weather did not last, as we all know, in this part of the country. It never lasts, right? Ever. And so about halfway down the lake, essentially a winter storm blew in. And it's a pretty contained valley, so it's bad news. Now, I'm sure you can imagine the possibility for disaster when you think about flat-bottom boats, top-heavy cannon, plus all of the ammunition, and a winter storm. And so these men were frightened for their lives. But Knox encouraged them. He cheered them on, and they rowed faster. And they managed to reach the end of the lake before a single cannon was lost. They didn't lose a man, and the lake didn't freeze over on them. But then they were faced with another challenge. Now we have to get all this stuff all the way to Cambridge. How are we going to do this? Well, Knox was prepared. He had bought or built a series of really heavy-duty sleds. There was only one problem. Anybody know what it was? No snow. So he had to wait 9 days, waiting for it to snow. You can't move sleds when there's no snow. And during this delay, he wrote to Washington stating, "It is not easy to conceive the difficulties we have had in getting them over the lake, owing to the advanced season of the year and contrary winds. But the danger is now past, and 3 days ago it was very uncertain whether we would be able to get them until next spring. I hope in 16 or 17 days to be able to present your excellency with a noble train of artillery." And that's what this whole expedition became known as from thenceforward, the noble train of artillery. But again, he faced another weather setback. He had to cross the Hudson River multiple times. Well, the Hudson River wasn't froze, as he found out after losing several cannon and the men with them. So he had to wait again until January 5th, until the Hudson River was frozen enough for him to make that crossing. You think, like a normal person would be pretty discouraged at this point, right? All this delays, this extremely hard work, but not Knox. And he got his men into Cambridge on the 24th of January. Now think about this. This is a trip of over 300 miles with several weather delays, over poor roads, through rough terrain, carrying really heavy cannon, all the ammunition, all the accoutrement, in 53 days. There's people that I know that couldn't walk that in 53 days. It's amazing, right? And Washington was not about to let this gift horse go. So on March 2nd, he distracted the British with some other firing and sent Knox and his men to emplace the cannon on the heights at Dorchester, which he did. He didn't just take the cannon up there. He had to build the emplacements. He had to build the revetments, the gun positions, and small fortifications, all in a single night. That alone is an impressive feat. So much so that the next day, when General Howe found out about this, it was heard to remark very incredulously, the rebels did more in one night than my entire army would have done in a month. That's crazy how hard and fast they were able to do this work. 2 nights later, Knox opened fire on the 4th. Immediately put the British in an untenable position. Because not only could his heavy cannon reach the city, but they could reach the bay as well. So they had nowhere to go. Now, Howe wanted to attack, but due to weather and some other circumstances, was unable to do so. So he was forced to load his men on the transports and get out of town to Halifax. So Knox, in my opinion, was pretty much solely responsible for ending the occupation of Boston. And this, to me, ranks up there with some of the more impressive military feats in all of American military history. I'm talking Scott's march from the coast to Mexico City. I'm talking Sherman's march to the sea. Stuart's first march around the Army of the Potomac. These things are legendary. And they always fell on the shoulders of one man. In this case, those shoulders were Henry Knox. And not only was the operation successful, but it led to the first setback the British had faced during the entire war up to this point. And he wasn't done. He continued to prove his worth to Washington, time in and time out. He stopped briefly in Connecticut and Rhode Island to build some coastal defenses like it's no big deal. And he showed up in New York City just in time to be thrown into the fortification as the British invade Upper Manhattan. So he took charge of these fortifications. And he threw himself into this work so much that he even stated, "I didn't change my uniform for 40 days. 40 days, imagine, we're in the same clothes. It could stand up on its own. It could do the work. He could go to sleep and let the uniform do the work for him. But as the British come marching down, he threw himself into trying to finish Fort Bunker Hill in New York City, where he attempted to rally fleeing Continentals because they were just like rats from a ship fleeing in front of the onrushing British horde because they had yet to receive any real training. That doesn't come for a few years. Bless you. He was one of the last men to leave Manhattan Island, and he only did so after he stole a boat to get off the island. Now, this, of course, made George Washington a little bit nervous because he was convinced that he had been killed or captured by the British. He proved his worth in the Jerseys. He was in charge of organizing and carrying out the crossing at McConkey's Ferry when Washington attacked Trenton and the Hessians at Trenton on Christmas Day. And again, imagine yourself. You don't have the proper clothing. You're dressed probably not much more warmly than you are now. It's a winter storm. It's late. You probably didn't have much to eat. You can see the ice flows in the river. And I have been to McConkey's Ferry in the winter, and I can tell you that it's not a pleasant thing. These big chunks of ice cracking and crashing together. They creak, and when they crack together, you can feel it in your feet. And so the morale was probably fairly low at the time. But afterwards, it may have been a little bit delayed, but it was successful. And many of them said that they were cheered by the stentorian voice of Henry Knox. Coincidentally, the following day, he was appointed, his appointment to Brigadier General came through. And upon finding out about this, he wrote to his wife saying, "It was unsolicited on my part, though I cannot say unexpected. People are more lavish in their praises of my poor endeavors than they deserve. All the merit I can claim is my industry." So for any of you in the military, what do all soldiers say when they're praised? "I was just doing my job." And that's what he was saying. I was just doing my job. He was later sent to New England. This leads to a couple little interesting little factoids about him that I find pretty fascinating. He had a lot more to offer Washington other than his tactical acumen, and Washington knew this. So he sent him to oversee the casting of some cannon and construction of a factory or laboratory for ammo and gunpowder. So he sent him up to New England, and Knox found the perfect place. And that place was Springfield, Massachusetts. And he wrote to Washington stating, "It is the best place in all the 4 New England states for a laboratory, cannon foundry, etc. And I hope your excellency will order it there." And many of you have probably heard of the Springfield Armory. It was very famous for producing such notable U.S. military weapons as the M1903 Springfield rifle, M1911 .45 pistol, and the ever incomparable M1 Garand, right? At the same time, he wrote a letter to the Continental Congress called Hints to the Congressional Committee. And this letter was full of all sorts of very practical suggestions, which, when looking back upon them, really show that he had a lot of foresight, way more than a lot of his other fellow commanders. He saw the future very well. And I think perhaps the most important suggestion in that paper was the formation of an academy. An academy where the whole theory and practice of fortifications and gunnery should be taught, which ultimately led to the foundation of the military academy at West Point, New York. Now, I'm not saying that Knox was solely responsible for the formation of these 2 iconic locations, but his suggestions carried a lot of weight, and he certainly had an impact on their founding. In battle after battle, Harry, as his wife called him, proved Washington's trust in him. At the disasters of Brandywine, and Germantown, one of the only few bright spots for the Continental Congress was Knox and his artillery. He was an excellent leader, and his men would follow him to the gates of hell, and they often seemed to do so. Now, one of the more unique, if you're familiar with the Battle of Germantown, Knox came upon the Chew House. And the Chew House was this stone mansion that was essentially a small fort. Well, about 200 British troops had taken over this house and fortified it even more. The rest of many other officers in the Continental Army just wanted to keep going, because up to this point in time, they were kind of winning the battle, and they were on a roll. They didn't want to stop. But Knox was a tactician. He knew you can't leave an active enemy force behind your line of advance? It makes no sense. Logically, it makes no sense, and it goes against pretty much every aspect of military dogma he'd ever read in his life. So he was, by God, we have to attack and take this house. Unfortunately, he only had light cannon and muskets, so he was unable to penetrate the thick walls. So he called upon help from men like Lord Sterling, Anthony Wayne. Help me take this house. And so they relented and they came. And this went back and forth for hours. And it looked like they might be successful until disaster struck in the form of General Adam Stephen. And Adam Stephen showed up. He was coming in on Anthony's left flank. And he came upon the scene and he thought the British were attacking. So he changed his line of battle. When you change your line of battle in the middle of combat, it never works out very well. Ask Dan Sickles about that at Gettysburg, how well that worked out. You just don't do it. But he did. And he fired into the rear of Anthony Wayne's men. And this basically caused the collapse of the battle. And again, up to that point, many Americans thought it was won. But because Stephen, who was later shown to be drunk, made a single bad move, it fell apart. Now, many want to blame Knox for this, because Knox was insistent on attacking this house. But George Washington and other leaders knew that this was fallacious, because not only had Washington approved the attack on the house, but he witnessed the whole thing, and he knew that it was Stephen's fault, not Knox's. Excuse me, I've got a cough for like 3 weeks. It's getting on my nerves. Now, after a rough winter at Valley Forge, which we're all familiar with, Knox was lucky. He didn't have to be in Valley Forge too much. He spent much of his winter with his family in Boston. But right after Valley Forge, the British met the Americans at Monmouth Courthouse. And once again, Knox proved his worth by personally reconnoitering the entire front. In addition to that, he rallied the retreating troops. The only difference between this and New York was they weren't a rout this time. They were just retreating in orderly fashion. And he actually served as a rear guard action where he took some formerly emplaced batteries and he used them to fight a rear guard action to slow the British down. And this time, he received not only praise from George Washington, which was becoming common at this point in time, but he received praise from the British, who said, no artillery could have been better served. So he was attracting the attention of the British, who now knew how talented he really was. And it wasn't just, again, it wasn't just tactics. Knox was constantly being relied on for other things. George Washington, especially this time in the war after a lot of setbacks, was a bit irascible, right? He was a bit moody, as you can imagine. Knox was a counterpoint to that. Knox was an optimist. He was a larger-than-life, jovial, he always has a positive attitude. He had an unshakable belief in the triumph of the American cause. He knew it was going to happen, and that helped Washington. And the two, like I said, the two are very good friends. And so he relied on that. Washington also relied on the wisdom of Knox, as can be seen when he was placed on the tribunal to try Major John Andre, the British spy, who was caught along with Benedict Arnold exchanging secrets about West Point. Now, Knox actually knew Andre from earlier in the war when Andre had been captured and he was awaiting patrol. And he actually respected him. He liked him. He believed he was a fine officer and a gentleman. And despite this, despite his personal feelings, he did what his duty called, and that was to find this man guilty of treason, or of spying, which ended with his execution. And it was one of those things that actually caused him some regret throughout the remaining bits of his life. Washington also trusted him, one of the few people, with a full plan for his attack on Yorktown. Not a lot of people knew the full plan, but he did. And despite years of work and effort, Knox was indefatigable. He was ready to go, especially because he believed that Yorktown would be the final major conflict between the two, which proved to be true. Not only did he come up with another artillery force that was sufficient to do what needed to be done. All sorts of gun of all sorts of sizes, but he built a lot of fortifications, emplacements, trenches, and the like, while his guns were firing. Once again, after Yorktown, Washington called out Knox specifically for how efficiently and effectively he had handled the artillery, and recommended his promotion to Major General, which dated from November 15th, 1781. Now, the war was effectively over. It didn't end for a few more years, but it was essentially over. But Knox wasn't done. Even though he wanted nothing more than to go home and return to his wife and his children, there was things to be done. There was too much work to be done, and Washington relied on him too much. I'm not going to go into a lot of that. I'll just bring out a couple things. In 1782, August, he was appointed command of the fort at West Point, where he was in charge of basically beefing up all of the issues that he had pointed out earlier about how defective the fort was at the time. It's also during this time that we really start to see Knox's ideology on the future government of the country emerge. He doesn't get a lot of credit for being a founding father, but he really was in a lot of ways. Unlike a lot of his compatriots, he, who believed that state government was the way to go, strong state governments, he saw the inherent flaw in strong state governments and believed in a stronger federal government. In a letter to Governor Morris, he actually stated, "The present Constitution," he's referring to the Articles of Confederation, "is so defective, why do not you great men call the people together and tell them so? That is, to have a convention of the states to form a better constitution." Again, we see some prescience almost, right? He's predicting what's going to happen. On August 1783, Washington's faith in Knox was put to the utmost when he appointed Knox as his successor to the entire army with the arduous task of disbanding it, right? They didn't want a standing army at this time, although Knox was convinced we needed one. I won't get into that. That's a story for another day. And like Washington, like I said, he wanted to go home. He wanted to spend his time with his wife and his children. But now his services were being sought at an even greater level. The Continental Congress in 1785 appointed Knox to be the Secretary of War before Washington. So Knox predated General George Washington in the federal government. And like Washington, he was a Federalist, and he was not a fan of the Confederation of States nor the Articles of Confederation because of the inherent weaknesses. As a soldier, he saw the problems that they had with pay, with morale, with equipment, with recruiting, because there was no strong driving force, right? And then after the war, things like Shays' Rebellion proved to him that they needed a strong central government. And he wrote a letter expressing his ideas about the Confederation of States. This is actually pretty funny. He was straightforward. He did not beat around the bush. And he stated, "The state systems are the accursed thing which will prevent our being a nation. The vile state governments are sources of pollution, which will contaminate the American name, perhaps for ages. Smite them in the name of God and the people." He was not holding back, I guess. Now, when Washington was elected unanimously, our first president, it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that Knox would continue his position as Secretary of War. He was the first man appointed to Washington's cabinet, and he had a lot of work to do, a lot of important work. Knox was convinced of the importance of a strong Navy. Up to this point in time, our Navy was like 2 rowboats and a sailboat. I mean, there wasn't much to it. But he knew we needed one because he saw how important the French were to our victory over the British. In addition, over in the North African Mediterranean area, the Barbary pirates were attacking merchantmen. So he knew we needed a Navy. And he pushed it. That doesn't sound good. He pushed for this Navy so much that he succeeded, even though many of the other people didn't really want a Navy because they were isolated. They didn't need a Navy. But he set the groundwork for a future Navy that was quite impressive. He was also charged with Indian affairs, which he personally engaged in. He didn't let other people do it. He took control, and he negotiated personally with these tribes, and he did so fairly. Unlike a lot of his fellow leaders who kind of brushed the Indians off, he wanted to treat them fairly. To the point where once these treaties were signed, he believed that if the white man broke the sovereignty of the Indian nations, they should be punished. Now, this didn't mean he couldn't bring the hammer when the hammer needed to be brought, as we can see when he sent General Anthony Wayne to defeat the forces of Blue Jacket and Little Turtle at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, after those two natives had beat first Josiah Harmer and then General Anthony, Arthur St. Clair at the Battle of Wabash, which had 3 times the number of casualties as the Little Bighorn. And although he found true pleasure in serving his country, he did want nothing more than to return home and take this boundless energy that he had and apply it to his young family. And now that the imminent threat of war had passed, he could no longer justify his absence from his wife. So on the 28th of December, he wrote to his beloved commander-in-chief, stating, "After having served my country for nearly 20 years, the greatest portion of which under your immediate auspices, it is with extreme reluctance that I find myself constrained to withdraw from so honorable a situation." And up to this point in time, he tried to resign, and Washington kept putting him off. There's too much work to be done. There's too much work to be done. But he couldn't do that anymore. So he let him go. And upon his retirement, he was still young. He was only 44. I'm 44. I don't turn 45 until September. So he's my age. That's crazy to think a guy my age did all of the things that he did. He moved to Thomaston, Maine, where he built a beautiful mansion, Montpelier, on his wife's property that she had inherited from her uncle. He raised children, some of his own and some other people's. He took actually responsibility for several of his good friends' children and their education. He became a very industrious and successful member of this society. But it wasn't to last. For on the 22nd of October, 1806, he swallowed a fragment of chicken bone. We all eat chicken tonight. Could have happened to us. Little tiny piece of chicken bone got stuck in his throat, led to an infection. 3 days later, the great man was dead. Now, there's a certain amount of irony in this hearty, hale, robust, larger-than-life individual being felled by something as small as a piece of chicken bone. And it was a sad day, not only for the city of Thomaston, where his impact could be felt literally in every aspect of the community. He had his fingers in everything. He was a beloved local statesman. But it was also a sad day for the country, because even though he had left the government, he still had influence. He still wrote a lot of letters. He still contacted and wrote and offered his opinion and his advice to those still in Washington. Well, it wasn't Washington at the time. Figuratively speaking, Washington. And the loss that many felt at the passing of this great man are perfectly summed up by the Marquis de Chastellux, who says of him, "To praise him for his military talents alone would be to deprive him of half the eulogium he merits. A man of understanding, gay, sincere, and honest. It is impossible to know him without esteeming him, or to see him without loving him." And so he may have passed on to the great beyond, but he lived on in the hearts and minds of his compatriots for many, many years. Now, I hope this speech has helped you gain a little bit of a better understanding of this man that I consider to be a relatively neglected member of that founding father generation. And despite a rather ordinary upbringing, his personal thirst for knowledge, especially anything having to do with the military, set the stage for what I consider to be one of the great American military stories of all time. He may not have been flashy, but his efforts, starting with the noble train of artillery, all the way through his personal dedication at the Battle of Yorktown, showed that the commander-in-chief picked the right person for the right job at the right time. The best man that he possibly could have. Now, if you know anything about George Washington, you know that he may not have been the greatest tactical commander there ever was. But what he was special at was picking the right person for the right job. And no man illustrates that ability more than Henry Knox. And although he personally wanted nothing more than to go home, he stayed on under Washington out of a sense of duty as his Secretary of War because he knew things needed to get done. And so he got most of those things done before he finally hung up his uniform and returned home. Now, I would like for you to think back to that young, overweight bookseller from Boston who went from nothing to Revolutionary War hero to Secretary of War in the span of about 13 years. That's crazy. 13 years. Where were you 13 years ago? Not Secretary of War, I am assuming. I don't recognize anybody. What do you think went through his mind as he pondered his own meteoric rise? I'm going to leave you with a poem that was written by Thomaston Local while Knox was still alive in order to praise this great man. Raised by thy toils, the brazen bulwark stands. Thy care creates it, and thy voice commands. Yet, as the truly brave are truly kind, and mildest manners mark the noblest mind. So while a country's wrongs thy spirit fires, and patriot ardor every deed inspires. Not more in arms revered than loved by fame, for every worth the social virtues claim. In war, the terror of the blazing line. In peace, the soul of gentleness is thine. Thank you. Hopefully learn some things.
Well, that concludes this portion.